Ladies and gentlemen, are you enjoying the conference? Excellent. I love the idea. Yes, it's marvelous. The people that put it together have come up with ideas, have hit a variety of different opinions and ideas. I think that's good to stretch our mind and to learn from many different sources. And right now, this is exciting. We have a legend who is going to speak for us and help us. He's a person that wrote a book that has had ramifications for many years, helping a lot of people, called The Creature from Jekyll Island. And this person now is talking to us about where we are, kind of an overview of where we are with the book. So if those of you that haven't seen it will be able to see it. Also, a short course on the Fed, what it is, that, and a look into the future, which I think is going to be very exciting. We're calling this presentation The Creature Revisited. And the perfect person to do that is G. Edward Griffin. He's ready to speak now. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to G. Edward Griffin.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Hi, everybody. Having a good time here? Yeah? Well, wait till I'm done. Well, welcome to the return of the creature, or something like that. We were trying to think of a good title for our talk. Revisited, yes. Well, that's what I'm here to do. You know, I used to talk a lot about the creature when my book first came out, and then it seemed like so many copies of it were made, and it was pirated so much, and I loved that, by the way. And everybody had heard the speech, so they started asking me to talk on other topics. And so this is kind of a return for me, actually, not a return for the creature, return to the topic. But the sponsors have asked me to not only cover the basics of what the Federal Reserve System is and what I used to talk a lot about, but also to try and bring it up to today and maybe a prediction a little bit into the future. So that's what I'm going to do. And first thing I have to do, though, is the most important part of the speech, which is to tell the joke. Okay, guy walks into a bar, and he has an ostrich with him. Yes, an ostrich. And the bartender looked at him. He said, sir, well, welcome. He couldn't get his eyes off the ostrich. They got up on the bar stools, and the bartender said, well, what can I get for you? And the guy said, well, I'll have a martini on the rocks, please. And he turned to the ostrich and he said, and what would you like? And blow me down, the ostrich spoke. And the ostrich said, oh, well, if you like that drink, I'll have that drink. I like everything that you like, so I'll have one too. So that's what happened. Well, they went through a little conversation, and when it came time to leave, the bartender asked if they wanted another drink. He said, no, that's quite enough. How much do I owe you? And the bartender said, well, he added up. He said, 2 martinis. That's $8.42, please. Pretty cheap price. You see, this is an old joke. And so the guy reached in his pocket, and he pulled out everything he had and threw it on the bar, and counted it out, and it was exactly the right amount to the penny. It was amazing. Okay. The next day, they came back, the guy with the ostrich, and the bartender said, well, you're back. He said, yes, what would you like to drink, sir? A martini? No, today we're going to have a Manhattan. And he turned to the ostrich and said, what would you like? And the ostrich said, oh, well, I always like what you like, so I'll have a Manhattan too. So they've served the Manhattan, and of course, you know what happens next. Would you like another? No, thank you. How much do I owe you? And he added it up, and it was $9.64, including the tax. He reached in his pocket, pulled it out, everything he had, put it on the bar, counted it out. It was exactly the right thing to the penny. Well, the third day came as sort of a repeat performance. This time, they didn't want any hard liquor. They just ordered 2 beers. And, the guy said, I'll have a beer. And you know what the ostrich said? The ostrich said, well, I always like what you like, so if you want a beer, that's fine with me. So it came time for the beer, and how much was it? Well, that was only, how much would 2 beers be? Maybe $9 or something like that. $9.12, let's say. So he reached in his pocket, and he pulled out exactly $9.12, counted it out to the penny. And the bartender said, sir, he said, excuse me, I have to ask you a question. He said, I don't get to see an ostrich in my bar very often. That's amazing. And even more so that it's a talking ostrich. But the most amazing part to me is how come you always have exactly the right amount of money in your pocket? And the guy said, well, let me tell you a little story. One day, a few years ago, I was walking through an alley, and I saw this old pot. It was all dusty and all clouded with dirt, and I picked it up, and I was rubbing it off, and all of a sudden, the smoke started to come out of the pot. And lo and behold, a real, genuine genie appeared right there out of the pot. And he said, I was scared to death, but finally the genie stood in front of me, and he says, you have released me from my prison of the ages. And in return, for gratitude, I will grant you any 2 wishes you want. I said, really, genie, you will do that? Yes, I will. He said, all right. He said, boy, I've always wanted to be able to afford whatever I wanted to do. No matter how much it cost, it'd be nice just to have enough money to pay for it, no matter what, whether it was a trip around the world or a yacht or a hamburger, it didn't make any difference. I wish I could have the right amount of money. He said, ever since then, the genie went, vroom, your wish is granted. And the guy says, ever since then, no matter what I wanted, I reached in my pocket, or I opened up my checkbook, and there was the money. It was all quite to the penny. And then he said, the genie asked him for his second wish. He says, genie, I've always wanted a chick with long eyelashes and long, slender legs that always agreed with me on everything. I've got other genie jokes that are worse than that, but believe it or not, it has some bearing to what I want to talk about today, because I have to condense my presentation really down to a few words, and I've gotten fairly good at that over the years. It used to be that I didn't know how to condense anything, but you can condense almost any topic, if you have to, down to a few words. I could even condense my whole topic down into 3 words if I had to. In fact, maybe I will. It's a scam. How's that? But you want more meat than that. So what I did is I took this whole topic, these 2 parts. I'm going to talk about, my presentation is in 2 parts. So I'm going to talk about them in this fashion. And it's a 2-sentence summary. And here it goes. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created because Americans made a wish to the government genie to control the banks on behalf of the people. But what they got was a banking cartel that now controls the government. And then the second sentence. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Now that's everything I have to say in condensation. So let's skip past all of the amenities and the bad jokes and get to the topic itself. So let's start with that first part. Back in 1913, the reason, I'm going to tell you a little story about a trip to Jekyll Island, and that's the reason I titled my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And I know many, if not most of you, have already read the book. I won't even ask you how many, because it'll be depressing if too many hands go up, because I know I'm just talking to the choir. Oh, he did it anyway. Yeah, so you know this story, but nevertheless, maybe it's going to be recorded and somebody will see it on internet and they'll be amazed. So, The Creature from Jekyll Island is the title of my book, and the reason I gave it that title, well, there were a couple of reasons. I was always looking for a good title, It makes no difference how good your material is if you don't have a good title. So, they say you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge it by its title necessarily either. But in this case, you can, because I thought I would give it a mysterious sound so that people would think, The Creature from Jekyll Island. If they saw the book in the window of a bookstore, remember those bookstores? They used to have them out there. You could actually walk in and buy a book. And I thought if they ever saw a picture of it and it said Creature from Jekyll Island, they might think it was a sequel to Jurassic Park or something like that, and go in and buy it. But there is great meaning to it, because Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that the Federal Reserve System was created. Not only was it created in a strange place like that, not in the halls of Congress or anywhere near Washington, D.C., but it was done under conditions of extreme secrecy. I would not have any problem in a debate defending that statement. I could say that the conditions of secrecy surrounding this meeting were equal to or greater than the secrecy that surrounds any preparation for war. It was that extreme. I'll give you just a brief example. The men that went there were told to arrive at the train station in New Jersey late at night. They were going to get on board a train. At the end of the train, there was a private railroad car owned by Senator Nelson Aldrich, and they were all destined to get on that car and take a 1,000-mile journey southward, two nights and a day, and arrive at the port just there opposite Jekyll Island, Brunswick. And they were told to arrive at the train station separately, not to arrive together. If they saw each other, they were told not to acknowledge each other, not even to speak to each other, to pretend like they didn't know each other, not to dine together on their way. They were told that if they saw any newspaper reporters at the station, which, by the way, was a common thing in those days, back in those days, about the only way a newspaper reporter could catch a prominent person off guard and get a good photograph or maybe a quick statement is to catch them at the transportation portals to the city of New York or New Jersey. So there were always newspaper reporters hanging out there. And so they were told if they ran into any newspaper reporters, and if they were asked where they were going, they were told to tell them that they were going on a duck hunting trip. And one of them carried a big black shotgun case in his hand, or I guess his porter probably carried it, and he was prepared to demonstrate that, see, I'm going duck hunting, and he's got the shotgun. And we find out later that from his biographers and from his children who wrote about this, his name was Schiff, by the way, and he didn't even own a gun. That was a borrowed gun. He'd never fired one in his life. So when they got on board the train, they were told to speak to each other using first names only, not to use their last names, even on the privacy of this railroad car, this private car. And two of them even abandoned their first names and used code names. So there was nothing to connect them to reality. And we find out again from very reliable sources, including the papers of one of those men on board who wrote about this in later years. He said the reason for that was so that the porters, the servants on the train, would not recognize who they all were. Of course, they knew who Senator Aldrich was. He was their employer. But they did not know necessarily, and probably none of them knew on sight, who these other people were. And so that's how it worked. There was a lot of secrecy. We could go on even more. But it was incredible, the amount of secrecy. And frankly, it was that element of this research that I went through many years ago that caught my attention. I thought to myself, when people do things in secret, there's usually something to hide. And I wondered to myself, what could it possibly be? Why would it be so important to hide the identities of these men from the world? And therein, of course, lies the tale, because almost everything that we need to know about the Federal Reserve System, if we're aware enough, can be learned from studying what happened at that meeting on Jekyll Island. It was the genesis of the whole thing, and all the precautions that were taken, the issues that were discussed, the decisions that were made, all of these things tell us really all we need to know about the Federal Reserve today. So who were these people? Well, here they are. Senator Nelson Aldrich, I've already mentioned him. He was chairman of the National Monetary Commission. It was the assignment of that body of the Congress to draft legislation, proposed legislation to reform banking in America. Now, a little background on that is necessary, and this will have to be very short, but there was a lot of trouble in the banks prior to this time. The banks all around the country were failing. They were going bankrupt. There were people losing huge amounts of money. They're losing their life savings in the banks. And the banks were really under great pressure to shape up, so to speak. And so there was a hue and cry all across the land to break the grip of the money trust. Now, that's a quote. That phrase I discovered almost accidentally was a common phrase showing up in headlines in the old newspapers of the time. Back in those days when we did research, we couldn't just go to Google and say, throw in a few words and get it all dumped on us. Had to go down to the library and get in front of those big boxes, and you get the microfilm rolls of 35 millimeter film, which were images of all the pages of the major newspapers. You'd load them in, thread them through, turn the crank, and the image would show down on a plate about like this, and you could just look at history moving past you. It was kind of an exciting experience to see the history moving, and man, all of a sudden you're 3 months later and so forth. And I remember I was doing the part, and I was in the editorial sections, and I saw this thing come up twice. Break the grip of the money trust. Whoop, back up, what's that all about? So I found out that way that this was a common theme, not only among the public, but in Congress as well. Some of the outspoken opponents of the banking system were saying we must break the grip of the money trust, because everyone knew, they didn't understand how, but they knew that the bank was ripping them off, the banks were, and that they were restricting credit only for their friends, and they were manipulating interest rates and a lot of bad things, and losing money, of course, for the depositors. So to make a long story short, there was this huge demand for reform, and that meant, in most people's minds, it meant new legislation, which would put controls and regulations on the banking system, supposedly on behalf of the American people. So, Senator Aldrich was in charge of the committee that was given that job, and he spent quite a bit of time, actually, at taxpayers' expense, as I recall, traveling around Europe, checking how all the other magnificent banks of Europe were functioning and trying to learn how to imitate the banks of Europe, including the Bank of England, which did become the model after which they created the Federal Reserve System. So that was Aldrich, and he was an associate. He was an associate, a business associate, I should say, of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and he was the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, our former vice president. Remember him? Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Middle name was Aldrich, named after his famous grandfather. So Aldrich was very thick in the banking community, just the kind of guy you'd want to design legislation to control the banking fraternity. So that was the first one. The next one was Abraham Piatt Andrew, and he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time. Doesn't tell you very much about him because it makes him sound like he was a public servant. He was not. He was a banker. You might have noticed that most of our Treasury officials, especially the Secretary of the Treasuries, come from the banking community. They're not really public servants. They're lobbyists, really, or more than lobbyists. They're plants, I would say, from the banking industry. And it was true even then. Here was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Abraham Piatt Andrew, who came from a banking family. He was very closely tied with this. There's an interesting story which I included in the book about the trip to Moscow, how the banks actually sent their people, including Andrew. He was one of those who went to Moscow just prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, and they went literally with suitcases full of money, and they very generously funded the Bolshevik Revolution. They also funded, to a lesser extent, but significantly also, the opposition as well. It's one of the things you learn when you get into the history of this thing is that the banking industry, I guess, I don't know what to call it, business, has a long history and deep roots in financing both sides of conflicts. That way they don't really care who wins, and they'll come out pretty well on either side, and that was certainly true there. But most of the money went to the Bolshevik Revolution, and I won't take time with it now, but those of you, a few of you who have not read the book, you'll find it very interesting to see what they said about what they expected in return for their money and what, in fact, they did get for their money. In essence, they literally bought the Bolshevik Revolution by financing their leaders. An influence which you could see if you knew what to look for. You could see that thread in the tapestry of history ever since then. But again, that's not my topic. So that was Abraham Piatt Andrew. The third one was Frank Vanderlip. Vanderlip was president of the National City Bank of New York. He was the most powerful of the banks at that time, representing William Rockefeller and the investment house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Kuhn, Loeb, of course, was invested all around the world. Okay, we move on to Henry Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company. Benjamin Strong was there. He was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and he later became the first actual head of the Federal Reserve System after it was passed into law 3 years later in 1913. And Paul Warburg was there. He was a full partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And of course, he had his famous brothers that he stayed very close with, Max Warburg. And I said brothers, actually, I'm thinking of one brother. There was another guy that had two brothers. No, this had just one brother. It was Max Warburg. And of course, they were head of the Warburg Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. And a little interesting side story on that one. I guess everybody here probably has heard of Daddy Warbucks, the Little Orphan Annie cartoon series. Remember Daddy Warbucks? He was the very wealthy guy. He was a humanitarian, and he took care of Little Orphan Annie, and he became like her real father. But he was very wealthy, and he was very powerful. And if you ever got a picture of Warburg, and you laid it next to the cartoon character of Daddy Warbucks, they're the same. It was almost a caricature of Warburg. And most people knew it at the time. The cartoons coming from that period, we don't know it. And we would never know, like in most periods of time, like the nursery songs that come from Europe, Mary Had a Little Lamb, those all are political commentaries. We just didn't know it most of the time. So Little Orphan Annie had a lot of this commentary behind it. And Daddy Warbucks was certainly Warburg. And so the game of Monopoly, I'm digressing, I'm sorry for this, but I can't help it. The game of Monopoly, that little figure, the little fat figure with the mustache and the cigar, that's J.P. Morgan, a dead ringer for him, you see. And so if you know who these people are, the history becomes very rich and very much alive. So, okay. Those were the people that were on board the train for that historic trip. And according to the commentaries and analysis made at the time, taken from those newspaper accounts that went whizzing through my viewer, it was estimated by the journalists at the time that the people of that group on that train represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Now that's a lot of wealth. And these were the people that were going to create legislation to control the banks. Now the question comes up naturally, especially with skeptics, and I hope there are skeptics. I certainly was a skeptic when I came across this information at first. The question should come up, did it really happen that way, or is it a twist that somebody put on it because they wanted to make a point? Ladies and gentlemen, it really happened that way. And it's not difficult to prove. Everything I said and much more has been documented in the words of the people who were there. I don't believe in going into sources of critics of this sort of thing. I like to go to original sources and see what they said about it. And one of those people, as I mentioned before, was Frank Vanderlip. And Vanderlip wrote a book on all of this a few years later, but almost immediately after that, there was an well, not immediately, actually it was 1935, so that's a few years later, but he wrote an article that was published in the Saturday Evening Post on February 9, 1935, and he described this journey that I just described to you using almost the exact same words that I did. And the question comes up, and he describes, by the way, the code names and everything else. So that it's all there if you want to check it out for yourself. It's in the book, but you can also go now onto the internet and get these famous articles for yourself to see. So the question of the secrecy, why the secrecy, is explained by Vanderlip himself. And these are his words. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress. Of course. I mean, this is like asking the fox to build the hen house and install the security system. Yeah. If the people of America had known that the bill supposedly to control the big bad banks of America were written by the big bad bankers of America with their friends overseas as well, well, the whole scam, remember, it's a scam, my short version, it would have been exposed from the beginning, and it would not have happened. So that's the reason for the secrecy. There's something else that can be learned from studying that trip to Jekyll Island, however. And this perhaps is the most important part of all. When you look at the composition of that group, they represented the biggest banking and investment firms in America with very strong ties to the biggest banking and investment firms in Europe. Okay, what's wrong with that? Well, those were competitors. Competitors. Prior to this point, these institutions were in fierce competition with each other, vying for the greatest pieces of the financial action. And there was blood all over the streets in London and Wall Street, Paris. These people were fierce competitors. Put that fact next to another fact, which is precisely at this point in history, there was a transition taking place around the world, but heavily focused in America. Some historians refer to it as the dawning of the age of the cartel. It was a period in which competitors were coming together and coming into agreements not to compete any longer, so that they could control their markets, so they could preserve their profit margins, and they could share an industry, and as Rockefeller himself used to call it, it would be an organized or what was his favorite word? Something like organized. Anyway, by the way, Rockefeller's favorite line was, competition is a sin. Yeah. Now, he got to his position of power because of competition. He was a ruthless competitor, a successful competitor. But now that he and some of the others were on the top of the heap, they didn't want competition anymore. And so they started to form alliances with their former competitors. They started to intertwine their investments, their shareholding. They intertwined their board of directors in some cases. They came to agreements to share patents and processes and divide up territories. You know, you get North America, I get South America. You can have Asia over there. You build tractors, I build cars. We'll charge the same interest rates on our loans, so we don't have to compete on interest rates. And all of these things are the element of the creation of a cartel. And so in the beginning, there were just a few agreements now and then, but layered on top of each other. The layers got thicker and thicker and thicker until finally you came to a point It was maturing at this point in history, where you could not really tell much difference between the various components of these cartels because they did not compete. And they had an organized and controlled industry at their fingertips. So when you understand that that was happening at this point, and you realize that these were former competitors and they were really forming an agreement not to compete anymore. And they had decided to take that cartel agreement and pass it off to the American people as a bill to control banking. It was their bill to create a cartel disguised as a means of protecting the American people. The bankers I've discovered over the years are some of the most clever people in the world, especially at the higher levels. I'm not talking about the guys at the local bank. I mean, I've got some very good friends in local banks that I deal with. You'd be surprised how much they agree with me. But they're employed. So, you and I all know people who are employed by corporations and institutions of which they do not really approve, but it's groceries on the table, and they have to feed their families. So I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the ones at the top that come to meetings like at Jekyll Island and Bilderberg meetings and things like that, and they sit around and they come up with really clever plans. And this is what they do. These guys figured out that there was a clamor for political reform in banking, and they said to themselves, basically, okay, it's going to happen, so what do? Sit back and let it happen, or do we take the lead? We'll become the leaders of the reform movement. And that's what they did. It's what they always do. And it's not just the bankers that do this, by the way. You find that in many cartelled areas of our lives. So that basically has happened. I'm taking too long to explain it, but I think coming to a realization that the Federal Reserve System is not a government agency in any sense of the word, but is in reality a cartel, no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. It just happens to be a banking cartel. Once you understand that, then all of the imponderables, all the unanswerable questions, why are they doing that? Don't they see that that's not good for America? Don't they see that won't work? Don't they see that's going to fail? Why don't they wake up and be reasonable and logical people? It's because they are very reasonable and logical people. They are succeeding in their goal, and their goal is not what you think it is. What is their goal? Well, what's the goal of any cartel? To advance the position, the power, the prestige, the wealth of the members of the cartel, period. So the next time you hear the chairman of the Federal Reserve System testifying before a congressional committee, and they ask him, well, why did you raise the interest rates? Well, Mr. Chairman, we raised them because we wanted to cool down the economy so we could keep inflation under control for the American people, for you folks. Oh, well, then why did you raise the interest rate? I mean, lower them at this other. Well, it was, we wanted to stimulate employment for you folks. The truth of the matter is they don't care about you folks at all. All they care about is manipulating the economy to create the maximum amount of money in circulation as possible. That's sort of an oversimplification, but it's an understanding of the situation. Because you see, why or how do banks make their money? Let's ask that question. Well, they steal it, of course, but let's be more gentlemanly about it and see, how do they steal it? It looks like a very business-like proposition. They loan the money out and they collect interest on it. Now, in the good old days, when money was backed by gold or silver or something of tangible value that took human effort to create, the quantity of money was limited by the amount of human effort that people were willing to give to the project, and that was determined by what it could buy. You don't work and sweat digging out gold and silver from the ground and refining it if it doesn't buy anything. And if it buys a lot of things, well, you're willing to work harder and longer, so finally you create the money that is demanded in the economy, supply and demand, that old bugaboo. It always rises to the top. So the limit on the money is always determined by its purchasing power, the demand of the public. Well, that means since banks, their inventory is money, if you have a limited inventory on any company selling something, it's a limit on their ability to make a profit. Banks make more profit if they have more money to loan. If they have an unlimited amount of money to loan, they have an unlimited profit potential. Well, if you don't have to, if it doesn't cost you anything to make money, if you can just make it with the signature of a pen, well, you don't have to charge an awful lot of interest on it to show a profit. If it costs you nothing to make, you can really have low interest rates and make out like gangbusters. And that's the game. That's what they don't teach in school, is that the banks are interested always in a large money supply and a free-flowing money supply. They say, well, it's for you folks. It's so we got to flatten out that season between summer and winter when farmers have crops and they need money now, but then they don't need it. They make it very complicated and they draw charts on the board and graphs, and you think, I don't understand this. I hope I can get out of this class with a C. It's all bunk. You can't understand it because it's bunk. What they really want to do is be given the power to create money out of nothing for you folks so they can collect interest on nothing. Okay, that's what we got. So let's put this into review now and ask a little summary of what we got. This is a great condensation, by the way, but here we go. We got a corporation chartered by Congress, given the exclusive franchise to create the nation's money supply. I didn't even talk about that, but they did. Normally, countries issue their own money. And most people in America today think that their government issues the money. They don't. The government does not. It's issued by the Federal Reserve System. The old notes used to say, Treasury certificate, and it would say United States government or United States of America and so forth. Now it says Federal Reserve note. This money is issued by the Federal Reserve System because Congress passed it into law. Their cartel agreement said that's what they wanted to do, and Congress voted for it, and so now it's law. So they got the monopoly to create our nation's money supply, private banking institution. Just think about that for a moment. Doesn't that make you feel good all over? So we got that. And then we got a cartel that is a partner with the federal government to enforce cartel agreements and create the illusion of it being a public agency. People think it's a public agency because if you violate the rules of the Federal Reserve System, you can go to prison. And only government can send you to prison, right? So therefore, Federal Reserve must be an extension of the government. Wrong. You don't even get half credit on that answer. The only reason you go to prison is because Congress passed into law the cartel agreement. So it's the Federal Reserve's agreement, it's the Federal Reserve's law, they wrote it, but Congress rubber stamped it and gave the power of government to it, but it's not government. We got a mechanism whereby Congress can raise unlimited revenue through a process of hidden taxation. This is inflation, of course, and the public doesn't even know about it. And I didn't talk about that either, but just imagine for a moment, if you can expand the money supply at will, and you can collect interest on every dollar that you create out of nothing, what are you going to do? You're going to expand the money supply like crazy. And you're going to cause the money supply to expand at a rate much faster than the expansion of goods and services that are bidding against that money, and therefore the cost will go up, 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 and we call that inflation. Prices aren't really going up. It's just that the value of the dollar is going down, and it comes out of our pocket. We pay for that through loss of purchasing power. And that's where Congress can tax us in this hidden taxation. We don't even know we're being taxed. It's called inflation. And the federal government can tax us in unlimited amounts. Unlimited amounts without ever having to pass a tax law or a tax lien at all. We got a law that allows the bank to collect interest on nothing. And we got a license to steal, because the Federal Reserve Act enables the banks to pass on their losses to the taxpayers in the name of rescuing the economy. We'll bail out this company and this bank and that bank. Bail out. We're rescuing people. Aren't we good guys? It's for you folks we're doing this. Notice who they're rescuing. They're rescuing the banks first, of course. They're at the top of the line. And then the next ones they rescue are the big companies that owe money to the banks. It all goes to the banks. And once you understand, you say normally, oh, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? Remember, they're doing it because they have to do it because they're a cartel. They have no choice. And as long as we allow this cartel to exist, it will never change. Just think about that. I think we've come to the point where either we abolish the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve System abolishes America. It's no choice. That's about it. And the Fed, yeah. So, yeah, I just want to emphasize to those who are watching and thinking, this could be true? Is he real? Where's his tin hat, just look at this. They're not stimulating the economy or anything like that. This is nothing but legalized plunder. So, to cut this short now, let's go on to the next part of my presentation. I better keep rolling here. Today, Americans are making another wish to the government genie, this time to create unlimited quantities of money to protect them from hardship, but quantities of money to protect them from hardship. I said that, cut, take two. But what they are getting is unlimited quantities of money being used to deprive them of their freedom. Okay, this is more my topic. When I say my topic, it's closer to my heart. Which is more important, financial security or freedom? That's a trick question. As Judge Napolitano said the other day, that's a trick question. I loved that guy. Actually, they're locked together. You can't separate them. If you do not have financial security, you cannot have freedom. It's impossible. If you do not have financial security, that means you're dependent on someone for your livelihood, for your very existence, for your food, your shelter, your clothing, your education, medical care, everything. And if you are dependent upon someone for all of those things, you are beholden to them. They can control you, and they have a right to control you. And in the world in which we live, all of the private auxiliary support structures, institutions that we would normally turn to for this kind of thing in times of need, they've been absorbed or abolished by the government. They've been absorbed into the government. All of the charities and everything are now government charities, right? So we turn to the government for everything. So we who are not, if we are not financially secure, that means we must obey the government, and they have absolute control over us. And if we just focus on the money issues, which is so easy to do, we think about, are we going to lose our money? Are we going to save our money? Are we going to make a lot of money? Or how are we going to preserve our money? What kind of form is our money going to be in? Is it going to be more efficient? All of the important things. I'm not trying to belittle any of that. But if that's our total focus, and we forget this other element, the other side of the coin, what does that mean for us? It means our liberty, our freedom is at stake on these issues. If we don't focus on that, we will lose everything. So, I come now to the point where I promised I would talk about the future. Where are we headed? Well, I don't know where we're headed. I don't have a crystal ball any more than anyone else. But I have a pretty good record of calling shots as to what's going to happen. I'm very bad on timing. Don't ask me the date. But I have got almost a perfect record at what is going to happen. I'm usually more pessimistic than, I don't know how these guys keep this bubble going and bigger. I've been expecting it to implode for quite a while. But I do know that it will. It will implode at some point. So where are we headed? First of all, the U.S. dollar and all fiat currencies of the world. Define fiat. It means a currency which is ordered into existence by decree. It comes from the French word fiat, to order, to a law, and so forth. If you have to force people by law to accept money, there's something wrong with the money. And And that is why all countries that use fiat money with laws, the Legal Tender Act in America, forces you to accept the American dollar or you go to prison. All countries that do that have money that is basically worthless. And they know that if people had a choice, they wouldn't accept those national currencies. So all of those national currencies are destined for the dustbin of history. Now, they may be replaced by more fiat currencies, which seems to be the trend. We go from one fiat to another, to another, to another, because we don't understand monetary principles. We think that if we just get rid of that old one, the new one will somehow be better. Sort of like choosing presidents. We hate this guy so much, or this gal so much. I don't care who goes in, it's got to be better than that. And then we find out, oh my gosh, it was worse after all. Same thing with money. If you don't understand what money is about, what a good monetary system should be, you're going to replace it with another bad one. So what we're headed for is the U.S. dollar is going to be worthless at some point, and I don't think it's too far away. Now, how that will come about, I don't know. There are several scenarios. I don't want to bore you with all of this. You know this. I mean, one is that it'll just become inflated out of existence, that its value will drop until it's worthless, and be like those poor people in Germany during the Weimar Republic, where they had these stacks and stacks of currency, and the only thing they were good for, really, is to burn in their furnaces to generate heat in the cold. It was more valuable as tinder in the fire than it was in the marketplace for money. That's one way that the U.S. dollar could go. I don't think it's going to go that way, but it could. Another way it could go into the dustbin of history is that it could be replaced by another kind of currency, and there's a lot of talk here about that hopeful proposition. But as long as there are legal tender laws in place making it illegal for you to do that, even though you might try to do it privately, and maybe they wouldn't detect it and so forth, still it could become illegal, and you'd be risking a lot to be able to participate in a normal commercial exchange. Not a very good solution. As long as the power remains in the hands of the state to force you to accept or reject a particular kind of money, it's kind of hard to come up with a real solution. Which is why my theme is always, let's get back to the core, which is the system. The system. The system has got to be changed. Another way the dollar might disappear is it might be metamorphized into a new kind of a money. Countries do that all the time. They phase out the old one and they bring in a new one with a new picture on it. And most of the zeros are removed, but it's still fiat money. So instead of needing 5,000 units to buy a loaf of bread, now you can buy it with 5. You got rid of the zeros, but nothing really changed in that transaction. There's a moment always during that period when there's some euphoria where people think, they solved the problem. We got this new money. Look, this money is now valuable. It only got a 5 on it instead of all those zeros, but we can get a loaf of bread with only 5 instead of 5,000. So therefore, this piece of paper is more valuable, right? It's still a piece of paper. So they might try and exchange it for a new U.S. dollar, or more likely, in my view, they're working very hard to create either a regional monetary unit. Probably, if they do that, it'll be called the Amero, in imitation of the euro. And the trend has always been, from the very beginning, to create transitional monetary systems to go from national money to a true international currency. And so I still think that's the plan, although now there's some talk being made at these high-level financial meetings that they will skip that step. And if there's an economic crisis of some kind of sufficient magnitude, and they have ways of making it of sufficient magnitude if they want to, if there's such a crisis, they're talking about going immediately to an international currency with, special drawing rights and all that kind of thing. And everybody chips in a little bit from their own fiat currencies. And so if we build a new international fiat currency based on little pieces of national fiat currency, that'll solve the problem. And that's where they seem to be going with it today. But no matter which way it goes, I don't think the U.S. dollar is going to remain the dominant medium of international exchange a lot longer. Don't ask me how much, I don't know. But I'm just thinking that a 5-year cycle is probably pretty optimistic. But remember what I said before, I'm very bad on dates. But I do know that it has to happen that way. I think that the destruction by inflation is inevitable. Why? Because that's the only trick these people know. This cartel does not survive well. It does not do well on the basis of a stable monetary system. It's kind of a Ponzi scheme. You've got to have it expanding. You've got to be able to have some people paid off and doing well. So you can hold these people up and say, look, this person has made a lot of money. This person is wealthy. This person is doing very well. Now, we won't worry about all those people in the tents back there. It's a Ponzi scheme, and there's no question about that. And it's the only trick they know, because if they converted, if they stood still for 1 minute and even allowed you to discuss the possibility of having a national currency based on something of intrinsic value, which would limit its supply, well, the game would be over for them. So as long as they are in Washington, D.C., as long as they have any authority over the monetary system at all, it won't work, in my view. Now, there is some talk that maybe we could put them into a cage, and give them a very narrow assignment and don't let them out of that assignment. And I wouldn't argue against that. I would be all for that. But I sure want to see that cage, because this creature is powerful and very, very deceptive. Okay, enough of that. I think that more fiat money is on the road, as I said, but I don't think it's going to solve our problem, because that's not its purpose. The expansion of the money supply really is not to solve the problem of the economy. Remember, we're dealing with a cartel. They couldn't care less about the economy as long as it's profitable to them. So if that's not the purpose of creating the money, that's not going to solve the problem. The true agenda, now I get to it. We have to get off of the issue now of economics and go to something that touches on the realm of ideology, philosophy. The true agenda, in my opinion, is global government based on the model of collectivism. And the money system is being used to drive us in that direction. That is the true goal. And at the end of that process, money really won't make much difference. It won't make any difference whether it's in paper or digital form, or whether you've got a chip in your hand or what. It will have no value except what the state decrees it to have. And you will be given the number of units that you earn in direct proportion to the degree to which you support the state. If you oppose the state, you're not going to get as many units as those who support it. And if you really oppose the state, you won't have any units at all. And that means you will be thrown into charity on your friends and your relatives and people you don't know, all of whom themselves are struggling for survival, so you will probably not make it. It's the ultimate control over human beings, if you can control the money supply to that extent, which is total. And I think that is the goal. It's sort of in the transition stage. We recognize it as the Soviet model or the Red China model, where the whole economy is the command economy. It's determined by political edict and decree, and there's no free market left. All of these poor souls out there wanting to occupy Wall Street, calling for an end to capitalism. Don't they know that was gone 100 years ago? No, they don't. They think that all of the problems and the ills of our present system, which are caused by socialism — I don't like that word because I think the better word is collectivism — all of these problems are caused by collectivism, not capitalism. We don't have crony capitalism. We have crony socialism. Why do people, even on our point of view, say, well, the crony capitalists? Because you buy into the propaganda and the press. They call it crony capitalism is always, well, the crony capitalists. No, they're not crony capitalists. There are no capitalists left, except maybe in this room. And we're wannabes, they won't let us be. True capitalism, the classic definition, relies on a free market, unfettered interference in a free market. That's part of capitalism. We don't have that anywhere in the world today. So anyway, I can get off on that soapbox, but let me come back. What can be done now? Oh, here's one I got to back up on. This is very important. Looking ahead in the future. What I'm about to say will not sound at all strange today. But the last time I made this comment, I'm trying to remember, I think it was about 3 years ago when I talked on this topic. Quite a while ago, I was looked at like I was some kind of a weirdo. So here it is. The United Nations and all governments are now preparing for massive civil unrest. Massive unrest in the streets. And they are well aware that it's coming. And in fact, they almost, I'm going to put the word almost in with question marks around it, almost want it. Because the people we're talking about, the deep state, I think is the current word, is a good word for it. The powers that be, another good word. We'll come back sometime and talk about who these people are. They want the end game to be that total collectivist system. And the only way to impose that on the people is to get the people to want it. And one of the best ways of getting the people to want total regimentation is by causing absolute chaos in society. Violence, chaos, civil war, race war, hatred. When you can generate that kind of an environment, people will be grateful. Be grateful for the military to come in. Martial law. They say, oh, thank goodness, they're finally here to restore peace to our streets. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what I see in the future, because it is already here now. But 3 or 4 years ago when I started to talk about it, people didn't think that was possible in America. It's not only possible, it is beginning to happen. Okay, I see I only have a couple of minutes left, so let me jump right ahead. What can you do? Well, there's the short view and the long view. People sometimes ask me, well, what can the average person do in this world situation? And my answer is stop being average. In truth, the average person can do nothing because the average person is so afraid and so conditioned to authority that they'll accept all of this meekly. So if you want to be a change agent of any kind, you've got to stop being average, and that means you've got to become involved. Well, you folks here are already in that category. You're not average, or you wouldn't be here. But maybe some people are looking at this on the television screen and thinking, yeah, I guess I better get up off my couch and get busy out there and bring about some constructive reform. So that's my closing message. The issue has come up earlier several times about what I'm involved with right now. Do I have a solution? I think I do, so I'll just dump it on you really fast here. I created Freedom Force International some years ago, 2002. Going like crazy, but never quite getting off the runway. But the principles were fine, everything was good. And then last year we found out a way to get into the air, and it's called the Red Pill Expo and the Red Pill University. It's a way to take some of these very serious ideas that we discuss at conferences like this and translate them into terms that the average person can understand, make them almost popular. So the red pill is a meme, sort of. And most people know that, according to the sci-fi movie The Matrix, if you take the red pill, you can see what's really going on. But if you don't like what's going on and you want to stay in your illusion, just take that blue pill and back you go to sleep. So we're giving people a choice now, the red pill or the blue pill. And you know what? to taking the red pill. It's a movement, it's an idea, it's a catchy thing, but it's a way to transist some of these ideas or to transmit some of these ideas from those of us that get so headbound with it and so involved with details. It's popularizing the idea that we've got to get organized and unified, and we've got to fight back against this creature from Jekyll Island and the creature from Manhattan Island. And so that's my invitation to you as I leave. Please check us out. Go to the internet and look up redpilluniversity.org. And I've written a little report, which I will happily send to you, download to you, as to what that's all about. So with that, I guess I'm out of time. That's my story. I'm sticking with it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, G. Edward Griffin. Oh, you can go this way.